The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, slipped beneath the door of Daniel Carter's apartment, like something the world had forgotten to address to someone more important. It was cream-colored, heavy stock, embossed with gold lettering that caught the light when Daniel turned it in his hands. His name was written across the front in calligraphy clean, deliberate strokes that somehow managed to look both formal and personal at once. He stood in his small kitchen, still wearing the jacket he hadn't bothered to hang up yet, reading the words printed inside. Emily Rhodes and Marcus Whitfield, the Grand Callaway Hotel, Saturday evening. Formal attire requested. He set it on the counter and stared at it for a long moment before putting the kettle on. Daniel was 38 years old and lived the kind of life that most people walked past without noticing. He rented a 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet part of the city. The second bedroom converted into a study stacked with books, folded maps, and manila folders full of notes on projects he helped other people complete. He drove a practical sedan with 112,000 miles on it. He cooked dinner most nights, usually something simple, because he'd raised his daughter Maya on home-cooked meals after her mother left when Maya was 3, and the habit had become its own kind of prayer. Maya was now 14, sharp-witted and kind, the kind of teenager who still sat beside her father on the couch while he read and didn't seem to think that was strange. He worked as a private consultant strategy and crisis management, mostly, but he kept no website, carried no business cards, and never attended industry conferences with name tags and cocktail hours. The people who needed him found him through the people he'd already helped, and that was enough. He did not own a designer watch. He did not drive anything with a logo he needed to explain. He wore his success the way some men wear old sweaters without thinking about it, because the warmth was already there. Maya was the anchor of his days and the lens through which he understood most of what mattered. She had inherited his patience and her mother's restlessness in roughly equal measure, and the combination made her one of those rare adolescents who was simultaneously curious about everything and comfortable waiting for the answers. She played piano with the kind of focused seriousness that suggested she had decided it was important without anyone telling her it should be. She read novels that were beyond her grade level and asked questions at dinner that sometimes caught Daniel off guard in the best possible way. He had raised her largely alone, and he had not found it lonely, because she was good company, and because he had always understood that the quality of a life was not measured in its audience size. He had not spoken to Emily Rhodes in 6 years. Not because anything had gone wrong between them, but because the distance of successful lives has a way of stretching itself without anyone deciding to let it. He knew her name now appeared regularly in business publications. He knew she had built a portfolio of luxury real estate developments that stretched across 4 major cities. He had read, without surprise, that her upcoming wedding to a hedge fund manager named Marcus Whitfield was being covered by 3 different society pages before the event even occurred. He was glad for her. He was also not entirely sure he should go. He was still holding that uncertainty when his phone rang. Sophia Grant's name lit up the screen, and he answered it because he always answered when Sophia called. She had been his closest friend for 15 years, a relationship that had begun, as their best ones often do, at exactly the wrong moment for both of them. She was 35 now, and ran a technology firm that had recently crossed the $1 billion valuation mark, a fact that had generated enormous press coverage, none of which Sophia had seemed to enjoy. She called him now from what sounded like the back seat of a car, her voice carrying that particular quality of measured certainty that meant she'd already thought the conversation through before dialing. She said she'd received the same invitation. She said she was going. Then she said something that cut through every hesitation Daniel had been quietly constructing all afternoon. "You have to be there," she told him. "There are debts of the heart that no one else can pay in your place." He didn't argue with her. He rarely did. Not because he deferred to her judgment, but because she had a habit of being right about the things that mattered. They agreed on a time. He went to find the dark vest suit hanging in the back of his closet. Not old, exactly, but worn in the way that good fabric gets worn when it belongs to someone who buys clothes for longevity rather than impression. He pressed it that night, hung it on the door, and thought about Emily Rhodes, standing in the rain outside a building that had changed both their lives. On Saturday evening, Daniel Carter and Sophia Grant, walked through the entrance of the Grand Callaway Hotel at 7 minutes past 7. The lobby was flooded with warm amber light that fell from chandeliers, so large they seemed to be borrowing ceiling space from the floor above. Marble stretched in every direction. Flowers, white orchids and cream ranunculus. Thousands of them cascaded from arrangements positioned at intervals along the promenade that led to the main ballroom. Staff in black moved with the practiced invisibility of people trained to be present without being noticed. It was exactly the kind of room that announced, without saying a word, that everyone inside it had been selected. The guests filling that room had been, in fact, selected with considerable care. A senator from the eastern seaboard stood near the champagne station with the comfortable posture of someone who'd attended 100 events exactly like this one. Two venture capitalists argued amiably near the windows, their voices lowered with the instinctive discretion of people who understood that money was serious business, even when surrounded by flowers. A celebrated architect who had recently completed a cultural center in Lisbon stood beside a documentary filmmaker whose last project had screened at 3 international festivals. There were tech executives, real estate developers, a former ambassador, 2 professional athletes who moved through the room with the self-conscious casualness of men who knew they were being recognized. The room smelled of money and good perfume and the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having worried about where the next meal was coming from. Waitstaff moved with balletic precision between the tables, offering items from silver trays with the wordless efficiency of people trained to anticipate desire before it became a request. The floral arrangements alone, someone would later calculate, had cost what a school teacher earned in a semester. No one at the event found this remarkable. That was the nature of the room. Excess existed below the threshold of notice, the way oxygen does. Daniel moved through the entrance of the ballroom and felt, with complete equanimity, that he did not quite belong to any of it. He was not troubled by this. He had spent enough time in rooms that weren't designed for him to understand that rooms did not determine his value. But others in the room were troubled on his behalf. Or rather, on their own behalf. Because his presence created a small confusion they could not immediately resolve. He was not wearing a watch that cost more than a car. His suit, though well cut and clean, did not carry the invisible signature of a name-brand atelier that the practiced eye could identify from across a room. He was simply a man of average presentation standing in a space constructed for extraordinary ones, and he seemed, inexplicably, unbothered by the discrepancy. The woman beside him was another matter. Sophia Grant's name was known. Her face, from several magazine profiles and a widely circulated feature piece about women reshaping the technology sector, was recognizable to at least a dozen people in the room. She wore deep navy with architectural simplicity, the kind of dress that required no accessories to make its point, and she moved with the specific authority of someone who had learned that confidence was not a performance. People noticed her immediately. A few waved. Several others, noticing the man beside her, worked through a rapid sequence of calculations. He was clearly with her. He was clearly not a date in the conventional sense. Their ease together was too specific, too old. Perhaps an advisor. Perhaps a board member whose public profile she'd somehow missed. Perhaps a driver who had been invited in from the cold, though that explanation satisfied no one because drivers did not typically carry themselves with that particular quality of stillness. A man in a charcoal suit. Someone who introduced himself to the table at large as a partner at a private equity firm, leaned toward the woman beside him and said, in a voice just below the threshold of discretion, "Who is he exactly? Is he her driver?" The woman shrugged. Another guest nearby, younger, with the studied carelessness of someone who had worked very hard to appear as though he had not, offered his own hypothesis. Service staff, maybe. Event coordinator. Neither of them seemed to consider that they might be wrong. They exchanged glances that contained a small, mutual pleasure. The pleasure of categorizing, of placing a person into the correct box, and moving on. Others recognized Sophia properly, and found themselves genuinely puzzled. One woman, a real estate attorney who ran in circles adjacent to Emily's professional world, touched her husband's arm and said quietly, "That's Sophia Grant, the tech CEO. Why on earth would she arrive with someone like that?" The husband had no answer. No one in the room had an answer, and the absence of one created a low-grade hum of attention that was not quite curiosity and not quite discomfort, but something between the two. Daniel was aware of it. He had been aware of such things his entire adult life, and had long since made peace with the fact that first impressions were the province of strangers. And he was in no great hurry to become less strange to anyone in this room. Sophia caught the looks, and returned none of them. She had attended enough rooms like this one to know that the currency of other people's judgment was worthless to her. She stood beside her friend and accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, and said something low and dry that made Daniel smile. Then a man in his mid-40s, expansive in both build and manner, a hotelier named Garrett, who had apparently known Emily's family for years, moved toward Daniel with the deliberate energy of someone who had decided to be friendly in a way that wasn't quite friendly. He planted himself with a glass of champagne and said, loud enough for the small cluster nearby to hear clearly, "You're really acquainted with the bride?" That's surprising. There was no aggression in it. Exactly. There was something worse, the comfortable dismissal of a man who had never considered that his assumptions could be incorrect. Daniel looked at him without any particular expression and said, "We've known each other a good while." The cluster nearby laughed softly, not cruelly, but automatically, the way people laugh when someone says something that confirms what they were already thinking. Daniel did not explain further. He did not feel the need to. He would not need to wait long. Emily Rhodes appeared at the far end of the ballroom at 7:30, and the room rearranged itself around her the way rooms always did when a bride walks through them. She was in ivory, not white. Ivory with a train that moved like water behind her, and a simplicity of design that spoke to taste rather than extravagance. Her hair was pinned back at the neck, with a single arrangement of small flowers. She looked radiant in the way that certain people do when they have spent years building something they believe in and are finally, in this moment, allowing themselves to be present inside their own life. She was greeting guests with the careful attentiveness of someone who understood that each person in this room had made an effort to be here and deserved acknowledgement. She crossed the room. She spoke to the senator, embraced a woman who was apparently a college friend, accepted compliments with genuine warmth rather than performance. She was working the room with the grace of someone who was genuinely glad to see it full. And then she looked up across a distance of perhaps 30 feet, through the warm noise and light and movement of 200 people celebrating her, and she saw Daniel Carter standing near the bar with a glass of water in his hand. She stopped. The stopping was total. Not a gradual slowing. Not a distraction, but a complete and sudden cessation of motion. The way a person stops when they see something they had stopped believing they would ever see again. Her face changed. Something moved across it that was too private and too large for that room, too specific to be performed. Her eyes filled before she had taken a single step in his direction, and by the time she had crossed half the distance between them, the tears had already spilled over. And she was no longer the polished bride of an elegant wedding reception. She was simply Emily, 23 years old and frightened and grateful, arriving again at the moment that had changed the course of everything. She reached him and wrapped her arms around him without a word, and he held her with the ease of someone who had expected this, who had known it was coming, and had prepared himself for the weight of it. The room around them had gone partially quiet. People were watching. The category of watching had shifted. It was no longer the idle surveillance of strangers judging a mismatched arrival. It was something more attentive. Something was happening that they did not have the context to understand, and the absence of context made them still. Emily pulled back and looked at him. Her eyes were wet. She said, simply, "You came." And he said, equally simply, "I made a promise." She laughed then, briefly. The way people laugh when the emotion is too large for silence, and laughter is the nearest available release. The room around them watched and did not understand, and found, for the first time that evening, that it very much wanted to. The questions began to surface in small, separate conversations that spread across the room like ripples from a dropped stone. A cluster near the floral arrangement by the east window. Who was that man, and why had the bride reacted that way? A pair of guests near the bar, both of whom had been among those laughing minutes earlier, were now exchanging glances of a different quality, glances that contained the early architecture of reconsideration. A wedding planner spoke quietly into a headset and tried to restore the ambient flow of the evening, but the evening had already changed, and no amount of ambient flow was going to change it back. It was a mutual friend named Patricia, a woman who had known both Emily and Daniel in their 20s, who now ran a nonprofit focused on housing access and still wore her hair exactly as she had at 24, who first began to speak. She was sitting at a table near the center of the room, and she did it without drama, the way people tell stories that they've carried for a long time and are finally glad to put down. She had been there, she said, not exactly there but close enough. She knew what had happened. 15 years ago, she said. Emily Rhodes had been living in a city where she knew almost no one, working 2 jobs, one as a junior administrator at a property management firm, one as a weekend cashier at a grocery market, and trying to attend night classes in urban planning and real estate development. She was extraordinarily determined and almost entirely without resources. The apartment she rented was barely legal, a converted storage space on the 3rd floor of a building owned by a landlord who exploited the fact that his tenants had no good alternatives. Emily had been 3 months behind on rent, through no real failure of effort. She had been managing, barely, until the landlord announced a sudden increase, immediate, non-negotiable. And she had nowhere to go, and no one to ask. She had met Daniel through a shared connection, a mutual acquaintance who had moved through both their lives briefly and moved on. He was not wealthy then either. He was working contract work analysis, project management for a small firm that barely paid its bills. He learned about Emily's situation in the sideways fashion of communities that are small enough for information to travel. He did not make an announcement. He did not offer a loan with terms. He went to the landlord's office, negotiated a payment arrangement, the specifics of which Emily would not learn for years, and quietly settled the overdue amount himself. Then he continued to pay a portion of her rent, every month, for the following 8 months, until Emily had stabilized enough to manage on her own. He told no one. He made no accounting of it. The discovery, when it came, had arrived the way significant discoveries often do, through accident, through a document in a box that was not the document being searched for, a receipt folded into a folder of old correspondence from a building she no longer lived in. Emily had stared at it for a long time before she understood what she was reading. She had called the number on the receipt. The building manager, then elderly, had confirmed it with the careful accuracy of someone who had always suspected this story deserved to be told. He told her the man's name, which she already knew, and told her how many months it had continued, and told her that the man had asked for nothing in return except that Emily not be told. He said he had been instructed, if she ever asked, to say the arrangement had been a building management error. He said he had always been a little ashamed that he had agreed to lie, and a little glad that the lie had protected someone who needed protection. Emily had sat down on the floor of wherever she was and cried for 20 minutes, not from grief, but from the sudden understanding of how many of her best mornings during those years had been paid for by someone who never intended to tell her so. He told Emily, when she eventually confronted him directly, that it had not been a gift. He said it had been an investment in someone he believed in, and that she owed him nothing because the investment had already paid dividends in the form of the person she'd become. Patricia stopped talking. The table around her was very quiet. A man in a charcoal suit, the private equity partner from earlier, set down his fork. Someone across the table said nothing. Someone else said, very quietly, "He paid her rent for 8 months and never said a word?" Patricia nodded and said, "Yes." That was what he had done. The shift in the room was subtle at first. The way the temperature of a room changes before a storm, not in any measurable sense, but in some pressure that the body registers before the mind can name it. People who had laughed at Daniel's expense 30 minutes earlier were no longer laughing. Some were looking at the tablecloths. Some were looking at Daniel himself, who was now seated at a table near the side of the room, speaking quietly with Sophia and an older couple who seemed to know him well. Sophia Grant stood. She had not planned to speak, or if she had planned it, she had planned it with the calm deliberateness that characterized everything she did. She stood and the table around her looked up, and then the tables adjacent. And something about her stillness carried across the room, so that by the time she began to speak, the noise level had already dropped by half. A man nearby, a venture capitalist who had been in the middle of a story, stopped mid-sentence. She said that she wanted to share something. She said she was going to be brief, and then, in the precise and unhurried way of someone who had organized very large things for a long time, and understood that clarity was more powerful than emotion, she told them about the worst month of her professional life. She had been 27. Her first company, a logistics software startup that she had built over 3 years from her spare bedroom, with 2 co-founders and a server rack, held together with determination and cable ties, had collapsed. Not dramatically, not publicly, but completely. A funding round had failed. A key partnership had dissolved. A co-founder had left and taken a client relationship worth 40% of their projected revenue. She had been sitting in what remained of the office, which at that point was mostly just her and 2 monitors, and a lease she couldn't afford to exit, looking at a spreadsheet that ended in red, regardless of how many times she reconfigured the variables, and she had been very close to the decision to quit entirely. Not just the company. The whole enterprise of trying. She had been, she said. And she said this without sentimentality, as simple reportage in the particular kind of despair that comes not from a single catastrophic failure, but from the accumulation of small defeats over a long enough period that they begin to feel like evidence of something permanent. She had stopped believing that the next version of her plan would be different from the last version. She had stopped, in some essential way, believing in herself. And that loss, the loss of belief in the possibility of one's own future was, she said, the most dangerous thing she had ever experienced. More dangerous than any of the external circumstances that had produced it. She had met Daniel at an industry event she'd attended, mostly because the venue was warm and admission was free. He had not known who she was. He had not been impressed by her credentials, because at that point, she had none that were worth impressing anyone with. He had simply listened the way some people listen. The way that makes you feel that what you're saying is the only thing currently happening in the world. And then he had done several things. He had introduced her, the following week, to 2 people from his network, a supply chain specialist who would become her first key hire in the rebuilt company, and an early-stage investor who would provide the capital that allowed her to start again. He had also spent 3 evenings over 2 weeks working through her business model with her, asking questions that dismantled her assumptions and rebuilt them more soundly. He had taken no equity. He had asked for no advisory credit. He had sent no invoice. If Daniel Carter had not sat across from me in that room, Sophia said, there would be no company. There would be no valuation number for publications to report. There would be just a woman who had tried and given up. She paused, and he never once mentioned it afterward. Not once. In 15 years, the ballroom was very quiet. Someone at a far table had put down their champagne glass. The wedding planner had stopped speaking into her headset. The senator had turned to face Sophia with an expression of concentrated attention. Daniel was looking at the tablecloth. The quiet lasted for a moment, and then broke. As quiet does. And the conversations that followed were different in quality from the conversations that had come before. A man named Richard, who had been sitting near the east wall most of the evening. Richard was a corporate attorney, 61 years old, with a practice that handled mergers and acquisitions for mid-size manufacturing firms. He said that 12 years ago his firm had been within days of dissolution, not bankruptcy, exactly, but close enough that the distinction hadn't mattered, because a deal had collapsed in a way that had exposed liabilities he hadn't anticipated, and a partner had left in a manner that had cost him 3 key clients in a single week. He said that Daniel had spent 2 weekends helping him structure a negotiated settlement that kept the firm alive. He said Daniel had driven 4 hours each way on both weekends. He said Daniel had asked for nothing. A physician named Dr. Laura Hendricks, who practiced internal medicine and had known Daniel through a neighborhood connection years ago, said that she had finished her residency in financial crisis, student debt, an unexpected family situation, a licensing issue that had nearly derailed her practice before it began. She said Daniel had connected her with the right attorney, helped her draft a response to a regulatory inquiry, and personally vouched for her to a hospital administrator at a moment when her professional reputation had been too fragile to withstand another challenge without outside support. She said she had wanted to repay him several times over the years, and had found, each time, that he declined in a way that made declining feel like a gift. A property developer named James, who had built his company over 20 years from a single apartment building purchase to a regional portfolio worth nearly $400 million, said that he had been on the edge of bankruptcy in his second year of operation when a contractor had stolen from him and a bank had called in a loan at the worst possible moment. He said Daniel had found the mechanism, a specific clause in a financing agreement, something the bank itself had overlooked, that had given him the time he needed to restructure. He said that, without that clause, found by a man who had no formal legal training and had simply read the documents more carefully than anyone else in the room, his company would not exist. He said he had never forgotten it. One by one, the room rearranged its understanding of the man in the plain dark suit. The process was quiet and irrevocable. The way the understanding of important things usually is. The man from private equity had been sitting very still for some time. The young man who had suggested Daniel might be service staff was examining a point slightly to the left of Daniel's shoulder, with the focused attention of a person who would very much like to be elsewhere. The hotelier named Garrett, who had asked his loud question with such comfortable confidence earlier in the evening, was holding his champagne glass as though it had become heavier than he remembered. And then the music, which had been playing softly in the background, stopped. It stopped because someone had stepped out of the anteroom adjacent to the ballroom with an expression that the wedding coordinator recognized immediately, the expression of a person carrying bad news and trying to decide exactly how bad. The coordinator intercepted him and they spoke for 45 seconds in a corner. And then the coordinator went to find Emily's father. The problem, as it unfolded in the next 10 minutes in a series of urgent conversations near the entrance of the ballroom, was this. Marcus Whitfield's primary business partner, a man named Colton Reeves, who had a reputation for making entrances at inconvenient moments, had arrived at the hotel not as a guest but as a legal process server, accompanied by 2 attorneys and a document accusing Marcus's firm of misappropriating $47 million in investor funds. The accusation was, as far as anyone present understood it, substantially and demonstrably false, the result of a data error in a quarterly report that had been spotted, corrected, and filed 3 months earlier. But Reeves had obtained the earlier erroneous report and had filed an emergency motion that, if not responded to within the next several hours, would trigger an automatic freeze on assets that would encompass accounts tied to both Marcus's firm and Emily's property development business. The wedding itself was not in danger. Emily's reputation was. The family's attorney had been reached by phone and was somewhere on a highway 40 minutes away. Marcus was somewhere between furious and pale. Emily's father, a man named Edward Rhodes, who had spent 40 years in industrial manufacturing and had the particular steadiness of men who had survived real catastrophe, was standing near the entrance with his hands in his pockets and a look on his face that suggested he was calculating options and finding fewer of them than he needed. Daniel had not moved from his table during any of this. He had been watching, with the stillness of a person who is simultaneously observing and processing, and Sophia had been watching him watch. She knew the expression. She had seen it before. She had seen it in a cold office 12 years ago, directed at a spreadsheet full of her failures, and she had learned that the stillness preceded action the way a breath precedes a sentence. She said nothing. She waited. He stood, said something brief to the couple at the table, and walked toward Edward Rhodes. They spoke for less than 3 minutes. What Daniel said in those 3 minutes was not dramatic. There was no rallying cry, no declaration of intent, no statement of the kind that gets remembered and repeated. He simply asked 4 specific questions in rapid succession, listened to the answers with complete attention, asked 1 follow-up question, and nodded once. Edward's posture, which had been carrying the particular rigidity of a man trying to hold a situation together through physical will, changed. Not dramatically. Edward was not a dramatic man, but perceptibly. Something settled. He nodded. He stepped aside. Daniel made 4 phone calls in the next 22 minutes. Sophia made 2. The first call went to a compliance attorney Daniel knew from a matter he had resolved for a financial services firm 8 years earlier. A woman who specialized in precisely this kind of regulatory emergency, and who answered on the second ring, because Daniel was one of approximately 6 people whose calls she answered on Saturday evenings without checking her messages first. The second call went to a forensic accountant who had worked with Daniel on 3 separate occasions and who, within 14 minutes, had accessed the corrected quarterly filing, compared it against the erroneous version, and documented the discrepancy with sufficient clarity to constitute an immediate legal rebuttal. The third call went to a senior partner at a firm that had represented Reeves in prior business dealings, a conversation during which, according to the facial expressions visible from across the room, information was exchanged that significantly altered Reeves's understanding of how the following morning was likely to unfold for him. The fourth call was brief and went to someone Daniel did not identify to anyone present. Reeves left the hotel at 9:43. The attorneys left with him. The emergency motion, by 10 past 10, had been formally challenged with documentation that made its continuation effectively untenable. The asset freeze did not materialize. The family attorney arrived at 10:15 and spent 20 minutes reviewing what had been accomplished before telling Edward Rhodes, with some admiration and a great deal of professional irritation at not having been needed, that the situation had been handled as well as it could possibly have been handled. Emily did not know the details of any of this until her father told her, quietly, near the entrance of the ballroom. She listened with her hands folded in front of her, the way she stood when she was receiving information she needed to process before she could respond to it. Then she looked across the room to where Daniel was sitting again, at his table, finishing a glass of water, apparently unremarkable, apparently just a man at a wedding who had found a seat and intended to use it. She found him there 20 minutes later. She sat beside him. She said very little because there was, she had found over the years, very little that was equal to what she felt, and it was more honest to say less than to approximate it badly with more. He said even less. They sat together for a few minutes in the kind of quiet that only belongs to people who have known each other across the full range of difficult circumstances and have nothing left to prove in either direction. Edward Rhodes had returned to the main ballroom by 11 o'clock. And at 11:15, he stepped onto the small stage where the band had been playing and asked for a moment of everyone's attention. The room gave it to him. He stood in the light with the quiet authority of a man who was not accustomed to public speaking but who had something to say that was going to be said regardless. He spoke about his daughter, and briefly, because he was a man who believed that brevity was a form of respect. He spoke about the years when the Rhodes family had faced ruin, real ruin, not the polished-down version of adversity that people referenced at speeches, but the kind that involved sealed envelopes from banks and friends who stopped returning calls, and the particular silence that descends on a family when everyone in it knows the truth, and no one wants to say it out loud. He said that during that time, there had been one person who had not turned away. He said that person had asked, as his only condition of helping, that his name never be attached to it. He said he had honored that request for a long time, and tonight he was breaking it, because some debts of gratitude were too large to carry indefinitely in silence. When he finished speaking, the ballroom was the quietest it had been all evening. Emily came to the stage then, and she took the microphone with a steadiness that was not composure so much as determination. The determination of a woman who had decided, at some point earlier in the evening, that she was going to say this and say it in front of everyone in this room, and that the discomfort of saying it was small compared to the rightness of it being said. She was not crying now. Her eyes were clear, and her voice was even, and she spoke the way people speak when they are saying something that is simply true and does not require decoration. She said that every person in that room had looked at her success over the years and seen something that belonged to her. They had seen her intelligence, her decisions, her risk tolerance, her timing, and she said those things were real. She had worked for all of it and did not apologize for any of it, but she said there was something that existed beneath all of it. A foundation that the visible structure of her success rested on, and that foundation had been built by a man who had never asked for acknowledgement and had actively avoided it. And she was going to acknowledge it anyway because the alternative, going through this entire evening, this wedding, this celebration of everything her life had become without saying it in public would have felt, to her, like a form of dishonesty she was not willing to commit. She said that she had rehearsed this speech 3 times in the anteroom before the ceremony, and had discarded every version because each version had been trying to sound like a speech, and this was not a speech. This was a fact. The fact was that there had been a night, 15 years ago, when she had sat in a kitchen that was barely hers with less money than she needed and more fear than she could manage, and she had not known how the next month was going to resolve itself. And the way it had resolved itself was because of a man in the next room who, tonight, had arrived in a plain dark suit and been mistaken for someone who should not have been there. She said she wanted everyone in the room to hold that thought for a moment. The man who had saved her, in the most literal sense of that word, was the same man this room had dismissed at the door. "You see what I've built," she said. "Not many people know who kept me standing long enough to build it." The room rose. Not all at once, it was not that kind of orchestrated moment, but in a gradual standing that moved from table to table as people chose, individually, to get to their feet, which made it feel less like social performance and more like an actual decision. The applause was sustained and genuine, and had in it a quality that applause rarely achieves in rooms this formal, the quality of real feeling, finding a formal avenue. Daniel looked at the table. He was not a man who found discomfort in attention exactly, but he was a man who had spent decades ensuring that attention was never the point, and suddenly being the point of a room of 200 people produced a sensation he did not entirely know what to do with. He managed it by remaining still and letting it pass over him, the way he had learned to manage most large things, by not moving against them and not being moved by them, and simply being present until they resolved. The man from private equity, whose name was Conrad, came to him at some point in the following hour. And Conrad was not a man accustomed to discomfort or the management thereof, which made the discomfort he wore now legible, in a way it might not have been on a more practiced face. He had spent the walk across the room rehearsing something. And whatever he had rehearsed dissolved when he arrived, because Daniel was looking at him without judgment, and without the anticipatory patience that sometimes functions as a form of pressure, and the absence of both made Conrad feel, paradoxically, more obligated to say something real. He said he owed Daniel an apology for things he had said and implied earlier in the evening. He said it briefly and directly, because he was a man who, when he recognized his failures, addressed them with the same efficiency he brought to his successes. He said he had been making the kind of assumptions he would have been deeply uncomfortable having made about him, and that recognizing that symmetry had been the most instructive moment of his evening. Daniel nodded. He said, "We size people up too quickly. I've done it too. It's all right." Conrad looked at him for a moment, and then said something that was clearly not the thing he had intended to say, but was the truer thing. "How do you get to be the kind of person you are?" Daniel thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved, rather than deflecting it with a modest non-answer. He said, "I think you just decide, early enough, that your life's purpose isn't about what it looks like." Conrad nodded slowly. It was the kind of answer that required time to fully receive, and Conrad was a man who understood that some returns were not immediate, and he was willing to wait for this one. The hotelier Garrett came to him too, and the young man with the studied carelessness, and 2 or 3 others who had contributed to the ambient dismissal of his arrival. Each conversation was brief. Each was accepted without theater. Daniel said some version of the same thing to most of them, that it was understandable, that it required no forgiveness because it caused no injury he had not already healed from before they inflicted it. Sophia watched from nearby, from a conversation she was technically participating in while actually observing, and thought that this was perhaps the most Daniel Carter thing she had ever seen him do, which was to make other people's cruelty easier to live with by refusing to hold it against them at any greater weight than they deserved. At 11:52, Daniel Carter said goodbye to Emily and Marcus. He embraced Emily and shook Marcus's hand, and said something to Marcus that made Marcus nod and look relieved. He spoke briefly to Edward Rhodes, who held his hand with both of his for a moment, in the way of men who have passed through serious things together and do not require words for the serious part. He said goodbye to Sophia, who walked with him to the lobby and stood with him while his car was brought around, and said nothing about the evening at all, because there was nothing to say that the evening had not already said better than either of them could have managed. He drove home through the quiet streets. The city at this hour was composed of its own kind of truth, stripped of its daytime performance, honest in its emptiness, its lit windows random and human. He passed a late-night diner with yellow light spilling through fogged glass. He passed a man walking a dog along a sidewalk that still held the warmth of the day. He passed through 3 green lights in a row, which seemed like a small and perfect thing. He thought about Maya, asleep at home under the care of his neighbor. He thought about the drive, and how the dark was not a complicated thing. He thought, briefly, about the 12-year-old version of himself who had decided, After a formative experience he rarely discussed, that the best possible use of a life was not the accumulation of recognition, but the distribution of capability, the giving of whatever he had to whoever needed it at the moment it was needed, without accounting, without ledger, without expectation of return. That decision had not been the product of philosophy or religion or any formal instruction. It had been the product of a specific afternoon in a specific year when someone had helped him in a way that cost them something real, and had done it without being asked and without lingering for the gratitude. He had never forgotten the feeling of being the recipient of that kind of generosity. He had decided, at 12, that he would try to be the source of it whenever the opportunity presented itself. He had spent the next 26 years making good on that decision, in ways both small and large. And he had found, over those years, that the most important thing about that decision was not what it produced in other people's lives, but what it prevented from developing in his own, the narrowness, the calculation, the slow erosion of genuine feeling that he had watched happen to people who measured everything against what they expected to receive in return. He pulled into his parking spot and sat for a moment with the engine off. Upstairs, Maya would be sleeping in the room, with the star-patterned curtains she had chosen herself. The apartment would be quiet and a little warm, and would smell of the pasta he had made for dinner before he left. He would check on her before he went to bed, and she would not stir, and he would stand in the doorway for a few seconds the way he had done every night of her life, absorbing the simple fact of her, which was the truest and most uncomplicated thing in his world. He got out of the car and walked toward the building and did not look back at the city behind him. In the Grand Callaway Hotel, the wedding reception had continued. The band had resumed. Champagne had been poured. People had danced and eaten and laughed and done the things people do at weddings, which are the things people do whenever they find themselves temporarily convinced that celebration is the appropriate response to being alive. But something in that room had changed and would not change back. The conversations carried a different frequency. People spoke to each other with a slightly more careful attention. Several people who had arrived with a fixed understanding of who mattered and who did not had left that understanding somewhere on the table beside the floral centerpiece and would not quite be able to recover it. The man who had walked in wearing a plain dark suit and been mistaken for a driver, for service staff, for someone who had arrived at the wrong event and been too confused to leave. That man had walked out at midnight with nothing he had not walked in with, and he had not seemed to notice the difference. And perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the point was that a person who has spent decades measuring their worth by a standard that no one else can see and no one else can take from them does not require the room's acknowledgement to remain whole. Some things are only understood at the end of evenings like this one, in the particular silence that descends when the last significant person has left, and the room is full of people who are only now beginning to understand what they witnessed. The person who had been regarded with the least regard, who had been placed at the bottom of every invisible hierarchy operating in that space, had turned out to be the reason the room existed in the form it did, had touched, quietly and without announcement, the lives of the woman being celebrated, the woman standing beside him, and half a dozen others who stood in that room tonight because someone had once decided, without being asked and without expectation of credit, to stand in theirs. The value of a person has never been held in the watch on their wrist, the car in their name, or the balance of any account. It lives, instead, in the silent and unglamorous work of making other people's lives more possible, in the decisions made without witnesses, in the help offered without condition, in the presence extended at the precise moments when presence is the rarest and most needed thing in the world. Some people understand this in theory. Daniel Carter had understood it in practice, for a long time, and had built from that understanding a life that could not be measured by any of the instruments available in a ballroom full of successful people, but could be felt, tonight, by every single one of them. The room was still, the people in it were standing, and the man they were standing for was already gone. He had always known that the truly irreplaceable things in life were never the things that could be displayed. You could not photograph the moment someone decides to believe in you when you have stopped believing in yourself. You could not frame the rent paid in silence, the phone call made at the right hour, the door held open when every other door was closing. You could not put it in a profile piece or a valuation report or a citation list. It existed only in the lives it had shaped, and it continued to exist there long after the moment of its giving, compounding quietly, the way all genuine investments do.